Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and we are back checking out another episode of the iconic internet horror series, The Backrooms. This is Missing Persons. Let's get into it. You know, as someone who grew up in the 90s, I just want to say that they really are doing a good job of capturing like the 90s vibe of things. It's also interesting to me that the 90s are now creepy, right? Like in the way that analog horror, the idea that old technology has a certain creepiness to it, right? And it's true, it kind of does, right? If you were to find, let's say, old videotapes from someone's home movies, right? And you were to watch them, even if there's nothing wrong with them, there's something creepy about knowing that everyone in those tapes might be dead or decades older, right? That, yeah, it's just weird. If you've never done it, it's a very, very weird experience to watch old, like decades old VHS tapes of people who have passed away. Interesting. I know the director, who supposedly is a 16-year-old kid, does get a lot of the interesting vibes right. You can see here's a big advertisement for Marlboro cigarettes. And as you know, before I think it was like 98, 99, cigarette advertising was pervasive. You would see billboards with the Marlboro Man on it. You would see cigarette signs everywhere. It was unregulated. And just like alcohol, it was just sold everywhere, and it was an addictive substance, right? So if you're selling something that's addictive, right, it practically sells itself. And then you add on to that advertising, and it can become a really, really scary, powerful effect. That's why just the number of Americans who smoked from about the 60s to the 80s was tremendous. And it's how the cigarette companies got so powerful that they were able to actually like suppress research about the link between cigarettes and lung cancer, as well as suppressing sort of other regulatory efforts against them. It's one of the weird effects of like kind of the American system, where if an industry gets big enough, it can actually fight against the government in regulating itself. Now, I'm curious. I wonder if that is real. My instinct is that it's not. Generally, since about the 60s, violent crime has been on a steady decline, and it's declined a lot since the 90s. Now, it's possible that missing persons reports have increased. Sometimes what happens when you have a reduced instance of crime, this is true, for example, of sexual assault reporting at universities, where the actual number of sexual assault reporting has increased despite a lot of work at preventing these from occurring. Education, creating safer environments, reducing the number one factor associated with assaults, which is alcohol. But all these efforts, but when you make reporting easier and when you reduce the stigma of reporting, you're actually going to see more of it. So it's possible, literally, sometimes you see graphs like this in the real world. Let's pull this back up here. Sometimes you see graphs like this in the real world and you go, well, what happened in 1990? And obviously in this horror film, right, it's the creation of the Backrooms. But in fact, sometimes in the real world, these can be rolling out, either changing definitions, where, for example, missing persons might include a bunch of categories that previously were excluded. Custody dispute type stuff, right? Or it could have been that a system suddenly got better. Suddenly, maybe a national system tracked all missing persons using computers, right? In the 80s, it might have been some police departments would report their missing persons, some wouldn't, and it was a paper system, which is not an efficient system. And this is true of a lot of data record keeping, but especially in law enforcement. Remember, some crimes are handled at the local level, some at the state, and some at the federal level. So federal crimes, right, are tracked by the federal government, by a central agency. But things like homicides or even burglaries, aggravated assaults, it can be really hard because different states have different definitions and different localities track them differently. Some in the 90s or 80s might have been using handwritten paperwork, and there's no way to get those stats all the way to the federal government. When you digitize these systems, use the internet and computer networks, suddenly all those stats can be fed into central databases, updated instantaneously. So it can look in a lot of cases like bad things are increasing, are getting worse. But really, it's not that they're getting worse, it's that they're getting reported accurately for the first time. Also, this is also really creepy. I really want to know where he filmed this. Or I mean, because they said some of this was CGI. And it's possible it's a CGI with a background, right? And then you sort of run it through this VHS filter. But these guys in the suits look pretty legit. Yeah, one of the things I hope you guys see about this is that wearing protective gear like a gas mask, it could be really disorienting, right? It eliminates your peripheral vision a lot, and it eliminates your hearing. And you don't realize necessarily until you spend a lot of time in those sort of outfits that you rely on things like your hearing. Your hearing tells you that your, buddy is still right behind you. Your peripheral vision lets you see things like shadows and movement off to the side. And so when you have all your senses working together, it can give you a really good sense of your surroundings, about what is around you, even in places where you can't necessarily see all the time. So when you lose those senses, your hearing gets muffled, your vision gets constricted, even things like the sound of your own breathing, that really happens. It can be a little bit harder for your brain to filter things out. So it can be really disorienting if you don't spend a lot of time in that gear. Right, one of the things that I think is really interesting is what's in the military we call it MOP gear or CBRN gear. And that looks basically exactly what these guys are wearing. There's no self-contained breathing apparatus, but you use a charcoal filter to filter out chemical and biological and radiological agents in the air. But for 20 years, right, the Taliban and the Iraqi insurgents, they weren't using these things, and you've got to win the war you're fighting today, not a theoretical war that has CBRN weapons deployed in the future. So the military, when I was in, basically I never put on my chemical gear at all. I think I did it once at my basic training in like 2006, and that's about it.
Go. Hold it. I don't know. I've never seen this like that. It may just be part of the environment.
It may just be part of the environment. It's all part of the environment.
But it makes no sense. Why would they be identical to you? This makes no sense.
Makes no sense. Nope. Well, nothing makes sense. It's the Backrooms. Yeah, it doesn't make sense about this, honestly, is that it looks like blood splatter, right? You can see, but I think it's supposed to be mold. But there's not really a reason that mold would grow like this.
This wasn't in the last report? No, this is definitely new.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a whole thing on blood splatter analysis. Again, I don't think this is blood splatter. I think he's going for like a mold, like
organic.
but because you can see here, this looks like mold or mildew that you would find on a well, in your house, right? But it's just growing in ways that don't really make a lot of sense. And one of the things that I think is worth noting is that moldy environments generally require moisture. It's one of the reasons that it's so bad if your roof leaks, because that moisture is one of the key ingredients to creating mold. And once you have mold, it's deploying spores, and those spores you can breathe in, and it spreads. And it's just bad news all around. It corrodes your wood and the stability of the frame of your house. But if you don't have those things, if you don't have a water source, then the mold can't really grow. Now, the human body, right, is 80% water, 70% water. So it's possible mold could grow on a decomposing body, but it's not clear that this is what that would look like.
Some kind of fungus.
All right, well, that was spooky, guys. No doubt about it. And I'm intrigued. So let me know in the comments if you want me to check out more of the Backroom series. I'm really into it. If you guys want me to break down some combat videos that are too spicy for YouTube, become a member of the Patreon. Thank you to all my patrons, truly. Yeah, and let me know if you want me to check out the Backrooms or other spooky internet stories. I love them. All right, I'll see you in the next one.